All right, what's up? This is Dr. Taylor Krick at the Washington Wellness Center here for our next food video on protein. So if you haven't seen our past videos, we've got them on fat, we've got them on carbs and sugar, we've got one on toxins in your food supply as well. Today's focus is protein, possibly the most controversial of all the different macronutrients, because we hear a lot about should we eat protein, are we eating too much protein, is protein associated with inflammation, with cancer, should we be vegetarian, should we avoid animal protein. So the purpose of today isn't to pick one side or the other, but to just bring some clarity to the conversation about protein and leave you off with some action steps about what are the good sources, how much protein should you be consuming, in my personal opinion. This isn't designed to be medical advice and a prescription to you, so I'm going to give a broad range and give some options and hopefully just bring some clarity to the protein conversation. We know that we got sugar wrong for many years. We know that sugar was added to a lot of foods throughout the 70s and the 80s. We know that we got fat wrong. We know that saturated fat is not as bad for you as we once thought. We know that there are good healthy fats. We know that we got those wrong. Science has now admitted that we've gotten those wrong. So what about protein? Very, very controversial, but really I think that the devil is in the details, and it doesn't have to be all black or all white. There's 1,000 shades of gray in between. So first off, protein is the building blocks of everything. I mean, everything that we have. So it's the building blocks of my skin, of my hair, of my eyes. It's the building blocks of my hormones. It's the building blocks of your neurotransmitters. It's the building blocks of your organs. It's the building blocks of everything. Everything is made of protein, and your genes, your human genome, you have 20 to 25,000 genes. All that genes do, literally all they do, genes are just a blueprint to code for proteins, and each gene codes for a specific protein, and those proteins form us. They form our tissues, they form our cells, they form our neurotransmitters, our membrane receptors, our everything, and really, really important stuff for protein. But often misunderstood in the context of our diet. So what I want to start with today is just, some myth busters and some things of, a question that might be commonly asked: does more protein equal more cancer? And that's something that you might read, you might watch a documentary, you might read a headline, but when you get into the research and you actually look at this research, it's not quite as cut and dry as the headlines make it out to seem. There are no doubt correlative studies that correlate protein intake with cancer, and that's what will get turned into a headline, will get turned into a documentary. They look at these correlative studies. So what that means is they just look at people and they say, how much protein do you eat, and then they correlate that with how likely you are to develop cancer, to develop heart disease, to develop these chronic and complex health conditions. And there's certainly a correlation, and so that might get turned into a headline: protein intake is correlated with cancer. But that's not the whole picture. And what they've found in those studies is those people also ate 800 calories more a day, they smoked more, they drank more, they exercised less, they were more stressed, they lived in more population dense areas. So there's all these other confounding factors that don't get taken into account with a lot of these correlative studies. So there's certainly some studies that link protein consumption with things like cancer, but you take into account the other variables and it's not going to be the same. Some of the other studies look at, people that live in cities tend to eat more protein because they have the conveniences. They've got the McDonald's, they've got the Burger Kings, they've got the fast food places, which, not to mention, we're going to get into in a minute, is just very, very low quality protein. So those people do eat more protein, but they also have more air pollution, they have more stress, there's all kinds of different factors that go into this. When you really get into the research, there has not been a study proving any causation of protein intake to cancer or any of these other conditions, kidney problems, they just don't exist. So there's some really interesting things within this debate. You hear people stand up and say protein is really, really bad, then you hear people stand up and say, like, show me the studies, show me the studies. And a lot of the studies that they show are correlative. Or other studies, I'd say, don't take into account the quality of protein. They feed a mouse soy protein isolates and say, oh, this protein led to this outcome, but that's a horrible quality protein. So there's some really, really big discrepancies in the protein literature. Now, at the same time, I'm not going to stand on a soapbox and say you have to eat meat, you have to eat a lot of protein. I'm not in that camp either. Some people say in that camp that that we're under eating protein, that we need protein to preserve our muscle mass, which is associated with better longevity, with decreased chronic disease. The more muscle mass that you have, the more fit you are. But it's a ratio. It's not just the more muscle-bound people live longer. Bodybuilders and NFL players have notoriously short lifespans. But it's muscle mass to fat ratio and lean body mass is a predictor of longevity and has a negative correlation with a lot of disease outcomes. So a lot of really gray areas when it comes to the research, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is so controversial. And like I said, it's not always black, it's not always white, but there's somewhere in the middle. I don't care if somebody gets all their protein sources from plant sources, but as I've mentioned before, I think there are a lot of problems with vegetarian and vegan diets. But if you avoid those problems, you're fine. I mean, one of the questions that I've raised before is, where do you think the 800-pound gorilla gets all of its muscle mass? It's not a carnivore. It does not eat meat. It gets all of its protein from munching on plants all day. Same thing with racehorses and stallions. They're not hunters, they're not obligate hunters, but they're pure muscle. So I don't necessarily think that you have to eat a lot of animal protein, but I do think that the quality of the protein is what matters. And I think that that's the gray area between the studies and the camps, and like you have to be vegetarian or you have to be paleo and eat all this meat, or be carnivore, which is gaining a lot of popularity. But I don't think that that's the case. I think that there's a gray area, and I think that you need protein diversity. I'm not saying to everybody to just eat a bunch of eggs or eat a bunch of meat and not get your plant-based proteins. I think you need a huge diversity of different proteins to get different amino acid profiles and different complexes and the other cofactors that come along with those things. Some of the things that you're going to get out of quinoa, you're not going to get out of red meat. Some of the things you're going to get out of red meat, zinc, riboflavin, B12, you're not going to get out of quinoa. So I think that having a good variety of all the things that I'm going to talk about is really, really important. So with the sourcing, let's skip over to the other side here and talk about the sourcing. So quality absolutely matters. Gluten is a protein, and your body can respond to that and react to that. You can have what's called celiac disease, or you can have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which impacts, I think the numbers are about 10% of the population, have a response to that. Another one is casein, which is an inflammatory protein, a common food trigger, food allergen in dairy. So gluten, dairy, soy protein isolates, those are really, really bad. So when you have a food sensitivity test, or you have a leaky gut and you develop autoimmunity, your body's reacting to plant protein, typically plant proteins. It could be casein, it could be something from egg, but what's most common today is that your body's reacting to these plant proteins of different types. Lectins, the lectin conversation is getting really popular. Gluten is, of course, really, really popular. So there is some gray area, and you have to understand what proteins are, but quality matters. Quality matters. And I think that's the take-home message in our sugar conversation. I think that's the take-home message in our fats conversation. It's not that it's good or bad. It's not that simple, but it's the quality matters. And so with feedlot meat, low quality protein, soy protein isolates, that I would expect that to lead to inflammation, to lead to heart disease, to lead to cancer, to lead to diabetes, to lead to chronic disease. I absolutely would expect low quality. On the plant side too, processed proteins, like I mentioned, the soy protein isolates, anything isolated, that's not the way that it's presented in nature. It's presented as a whole complex. So I'm not a big fan of any isolates, whey protein isolate included. But yeah, so quality absolutely matters in this conversation. But so where are your sources and what do you want to look for? Well, first off, from your plant sources, you need to be whole food and unprocessed. If you look at an ingredients label of something, I'm looking around to see if we have anything laying around, like a bag of chips, there's going to be protein in it. Where that comes from, who knows? How much is in there, who knows, gram wise. But there's protein in everything. Everything is made from proteins. So you do get protein from a lot of different sources, but you need it to be from a whole food source and from an unprocessed source. That's really, really important when you're looking at your protein sourcing. So where are you getting it from in the plant kingdom? Well, quinoa gets a really is really good. It's a good rep. It's a superfood. It's high fiber, but it's got a complete amino acid profile of the essential amino acids that your body requires, that your body's not able to make on its own. So for as far as a amino acid profile, quinoa is a great protein source. Now, you have to eat 6 cups of quinoa to equal the protein that you get from a 6-ounce chicken breast. So you need to eat a lot more. But once again, I come back to protein diversity is really, really important. And we're going to talk about, just the quantity needs. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to get the same amount of protein as a 6-ounce turkey breast, but to equal the same amount, to make 6 one, half a dozen the other, 6 cups of quinoa, which is a ton, versus 6 ounces of turkey breast, or of chicken breast rather. But that's a great one. Lentils are another great one. A lot of your legumes, a lot of your beans, chickpeas. I put beans down here at the bottom too, because you look at around the world where people live the longest, and a lot of rural communities and things. I've traveled to Central America, and we ate every single night rice and beans and chicken, and the chicken was slaughtered like that day in the backyard, and that's what we ate every single day. And then I've also traveled to Vietnam, and of course in Asia, rice, beans. Rice and beans is consumed worldwide, as lots and lots of different cultures that tend to live a pretty long time and don't suffer from chronic and complex inflammatory, long-term chronic health conditions and diseases. Rice and beans are a staple there. Then you throw on, some chicken, like I mentioned in South America or Central America. Maybe in Asia, it's a lot more rice or a lot more fish. There is a lot of chicken that's been slaughtered that day. There's some beef, but it's more of a delicacy. It's not every single meal. It's not every single time. Some other good sources: nuts. That is, your almonds, your cashews, your pistachios. Really, really macadamians, walnuts. Really great sources of protein there, and other things too. So that's the point, is you're getting the whole phytochemical spectrum from these foods. Walnuts being great for your brain, all of them having good sources of fat, having different phytonutrients and phytochemicals and antioxidants, and a just different profile from all of these whole food plant-based sources. And then your seeds. Seeds are a really great source. That's your hemp seed, your flax seed, your chia seed. Once again, great sources of fiber, great sources of good fats. But on your plant-based diet, those are going to be some of your higher protein food items where you're going to be trying to meet those requirements that we'll talk about here in a second. The best way to do this, and maybe I shouldn't say best because there's no judgment, but the easiest way to do this, and I do think that it is the best. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. Like I said, we see a lot of health issues in vegetarians and vegans, a lot of food sensitivities, a lot of gut issues, a lot of bloating, lots of long-term health problems. But I do think that it can be done correctly. But there's just a lot of misconceptions out there, I feel like. But your animal sources is going to be, a great place to get a lot more protein from. So this is things like, beef, and that's a huge one. Now, we talk all the time about the difference between quality beef. Today we're getting a delivery from our grass-fed beef farmer. That is not the same as a cow that was raised with 5,000 other cows, huddled together in a feedlot, being fed grains and soy and corn, and fattened up quickly, given antibiotics, given hormones, and then slaughtered, and then taken to like the the McDonald's meat packing factory or the Tyson chicken factory or whatever. That stuff is junk. So I think that if that's what you can afford quality wise, be a vegetarian. That stuff is bad for you. It is causing harm. But when it comes from a good whole food sourcing, I think that it can be a superfood. Meat consumption has actually gone down 25%, red meat consumption, since the mid 70s. Chicken consumption has gone up. And there are some problems that are associated with that. Many people say that we should be eating more red meat, but then once again, it's a huge burden on our environment. It's a huge burden. Now we have regenerative agriculture, we have new things coming around. So there's all kinds of nuances to this conversation. But red meat, good quality red meat, if you have a good source, like a good grass-fed farmer like we have through Hattie Livestock Farms, that's the number one source, I think, of protein. Poultry would be a close second. You know, chicken is an interesting thing. Once again, a feedlot chicken is nasty. I think that a lot of chicken is nasty. You know, your McDonald's, your salad that you order at any restaurant, like, oh, I'm gonna get the chicken salad and be healthy. That chicken is nasty. Comes from Cisco, comes from Tyson, comes from, you know, one of the major vendors of chicken that passes it along from everywhere in the country, and who knows how far it's traveled and what it was fed and all these different things. Now a chicken, like I mentioned, in Belize that was like slaughtered that day, probably a little bit different story in foraging and free range. So one of the things you want to look for with beef is that it's grass fed, and if you know the farmer, it's even better. One of the things with poultry is that it's free range. Free range, over here are some of the buzzwords that we want to look for. Free range and organic, I think, are really, really important on the poultry side of things. It is less expensive than red meat. It does, like, a little bit goes a long way. So, I mean, we probably eat more chicken in our family than we do red meat because just, you know, from a budget standpoint, and it's just, you know, we're not doing steak every day by any means, but we do some ground beef, we'll throw it up. But like I said, we try to get a good variety. For one thing, just for change, but for the other thing, for the amino acid profiles, for the other benefits, and we're just always trying to switch things up. So we might have each of these, you know, one night a week or something and change it up. And some of our meals might be completely vegetarian and bright colors, strong flavors, all the things that we always talk about with regards to that. Fish is another really great one, especially cold water fish, especially salmon, your omega-3s. And along, going back up to poultry real quick, eggs fall into that. I didn't have room to put it up there, but you know, your free-range eggs that are organic are really, really good. So our grass-fed farmer also brings us farm-raised eggs from his neighbor. So we do a lot of you know, free-range farm-raised eggs along with grass-fed free-ranging pasturing cattle is a really, really great combo. Now we're not carnivore diet. We typically would do that over a salad almost every single time. I eat, you know, usually 2 salads a day. But there's different proteins on there, there's different things cut up on there, and just like a whole lot of plant variety too with those plant species. But fish, wild caught, salmon is really great, the omega-3s. You know, that's something we didn't even get into with the grass-fed beef, but the omega-6 content versus the omega-3 content. And same thing with the plants. You don't want to be just loading up on a bunch of high omega-6 content plant-based sources, even if they're high in protein. That's getting more into the fats because omega-6s and omega-3s are fat ratios, but that's one of the problems and one of the things that can make this protein. It's not the protein itself, but it gives it a more inflammatory profile, even though the protein is meat protein. In a conventional cow versus an animal cow, so, you know, the proteins are going to be the same, but the fat profile is going to shift it more towards an inflammatory cascade rather than an anti-inflammatory cascade with the prostaglandins and different things. And wild game, I mean, wild game, it would be huge. You know, if you think about the way that our ancestors lived, you think about hunter-gatherers, you think about some of these things getting closer to nature, the best thing would be getting wild game. So like bison, I don't know if that's considered a wild game, but it is available. We eat bison, you know, fairly often, more in Utah than we did here. But, you know, around here, I think there is a good variety of game. If you're not a hunter, get to know a hunter. You know, I shot a deer last year, and it was great. You know, we had 60 pounds of meat in our freezer all year long. I knew exactly where it came from. I knew, you know, that I specifically asked that nothing be added to it, and it was a great source from an animal that I was able to harvest myself. So combine that with our local grass-fed beef farmer, and to me, for my family and myself, that's really high quality protein source. Now, the big question, how much do we need? Are we over consuming? Are we under consuming? There's people on both sides of that fence, and there's people that have flip-flopped. I mean, Dr. Mercola is one that saw that protein stimulates something called mTOR and these protein kinases, these nutrient sensing pathways that can stimulate growth, and growth in a cancer sense is really bad. But growth in a muscle sense, in a regeneration sense, is really good. So he's since flip-flopped back to now recommending a higher protein intake because of its protective effects on your muscle mass. So where's the answer? How much should you be eating? Well, it absolutely depends. Who are you? What do you do? Are you a CrossFit athlete, or are you, 50 pounds overweight and you sit at a cubicle all day? Your protein requirements are going to be drastically different in those two cases. Your muscle mass determines a lot of your protein, and your muscle usage determines a lot of your protein requirements. So I'm going to go through a couple examples here to look at just how much protein should you be eating. So first off, I said, are you an athlete, or are you aging? I want to touch on that real quick, that as you age, your protein requirements do go up. You need more protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. It is very true that you do not want to lose muscle mass as you age. A lot of times the reason that people, get worse in their health is because they can't get out of a chair and they can't do certain simple motions. And there's, some studies correlating this, lots of them, that people that can't do 10 push-ups, men that can't do 10 push-ups are not expected to live as long. And if you're able to do 40, it was kind of the upper echelon of, like, you're in the upper quartile or upper percentile of longevity expectations because of your strength. Same thing with, there's some aging test that's just like, can you get up out of your chair and without using your hands, and can you squat down in your chair? Can you get back up out of your chair? Basic functional tests. You don't need to be able to deadlift 500 pounds. You don't need to be able to bench press, 350, but staying strong, keeping a lean body mass, good percentage of muscle to fat and lean body ratio, and then keeping some strength is really important. Some people say that muscle is the organ of longevity because it's so protective against these things. So the average American eats 60 to 90 grams a day of protein. So 60 grams might be the average for women, and 90 grams might be the average for men. And really, to me, that's not too far off. Some people say that's too much. Some people say that's too little. It's not really that far off. What matters to me is the quality. I'm not a huge fan of counting macros, of knowing exactly how many grams of everything that you need. It's more about eating high quality diet and listening to your body, to me. But that's some recommendations. Now here's another recommendation. This is pretty prevalent in the literature as far as just kind of an ideal requirement. It's 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So per kilogram, the way to do that is take your body weight and divide it by 2.2. So I think I'm like 65 kilograms, maybe more than that. No, that's more than that. I think I'm like 75 kilograms actually. I forget. But so to me that'd be 75 to 95 grams per day. And with most body weights, with just kind of your average body weights, it'd be about 65 to 125 grams per day. Now, once again, you're a CrossFit athlete that weighs 160 pounds and you're burning through your muscle every day through intense workouts, it's going to be drastically different versus your 165 pound, couch potato and you work in a cubicle and you just have a sedentary lifestyle. It's going to be a little bit less. So there is a broad range. Now, some people on the other end of the spectrum who are calling for a higher protein intake, they're saying more like a gram per pound of body weight. And I think that that's lean body weight. So if you're 250 pounds with a 25% body fat percentage, that's not your lean body weight. You're carrying a lot of fat there. Your lean body weight. So for 120 pound to 200 grams per day would make more sense in that case. And that I think is, I don't think that's inappropriate. 40 grams of protein is what it takes to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. 40 grams in one bolus dosage at one meal stimulates muscle protein synthesis. That's one of two ways that you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis, your body making more muscle. The other one is through resistance exercise and through just exercise in general. But those are the ways to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So I think that as you age, your protein requirements go up. I think that if you're an athlete, your protein requirements are certainly going to be higher. I think that if you're a 45-year-old woman with 25 extra pounds that you'd like to lose, I think you should be on the lower end of this scale and focus on your carb and your fat balance and your overall caloric intake and some other things like hormone balance and things like that. I don't think that it really matters that you're in this much or this much or this much, but the range certainly varies and your lifestyle certainly dictates that. So protein, once again, just to recap, very, very controversial because you get people that are very, very passionate about animals and about that kind of battle and PETA, and there's a lot of advertising money that goes into that, and that's fine and cool. And then you get people over here that are like carnivore and you don't eat plants and this, that, and the other, and that's fine and cool too. They're both camps are within the health space, so you get them like bickering back and forth. But really, I don't think that either of them has it right. There's 50 shades of gray in the middle, and that's where the real magic is the quality matters. You could be eating too much, you could be eating too little of the wrong quality. And I think the quality is just more important than the quantity for how much you're getting, where you're getting it sourced from. Is it close to nature in the way that the protein was meant to be raised? Is the fatty acid profile that comes along with that protein good? Are there other things like hormones, antibiotics, that kind of nasty stuff? Or is it inflammatory proteins like gluten, like casein, like lectins, like wheat germ agglutinin, and these different inflammatory proteins that we look at from the plant kingdom? So I hope that brings some clarity to the protein conversation. The takeaway message is that what you really need to think about is your quality, and you can have a little bit of or a little bit of animal protein with each meal, and it's gonna go a longer way than plant protein. But I think that getting protein variety is the most beneficial thing, and getting it from all these different high quality whole food sources and the high quality animal products too. So I hope that brings some clarity on the protein conversation.